Hello, I'm Todd Wood. I'm president of Core Academy of Science, and I am pleased to be here with you sort of virtually today and to talk about my musings on the history of creationism as I ponder this question, what am I? I should warn you, I'm recording this at our office and classroom here in Dayton, Tennessee. It is going to be a bit noisy from time to time. There might even be a train go by. We'll just have to deal with the noise as it comes. So I apologize for that ahead of time, but we'll do what we can. All right, so what am I? History of creationism. So some of you know, recently published was this paper in a journal called Evolution, Education, and Outreach. This is by a guy named Joel Duff. I have corresponded with Joel on a number of occasions. He writes a blog. I believe it's called The Natural Historian. And his colleagues here, I'm not familiar with. Two colleagues that he's writing with, but the paper generally represents material that I have seen Joel talk about on his blog. And it is called, you can read the title, Descent with Modification, How Post-Creationism's Claim of Hyper-Rapid Speciation Opposes Yet Embraces Evolutionary Theory. So, I don't follow very closely what's being published in Evolution, Education, and Outreach. I got this alert from a friend on Facebook who messaged it to me, and then I started getting emails, then people started writing rebuttals. This created something of a stir in the world of young age creationism. And my initial response was, post-creationism, that's so adorable, it's very cute, what a cute name. I've seen this happen before. This is not the first time someone's tried to put a name on people like me, people who are sort of pushing the boundaries, if you will, of creation science and doing hard research and trying to understand better God's creation. And, you know, there's always those who are going to want to say, well, these guys are very different from those other guys over there, and so we need to give them a special name. Kurt Wise used to call us neo-creationists. I don't know if he still does, maybe he does. That word got kind of co-opted by Jeannie Scott to apply to people who advocate ID, intelligent design, whatever. Everyone wants to give us a name. And there's sort of an elitist feel to it. I don't know that I like it. Having my own special name, that I'm special and I'm not like those guys over there. That seems to me disrespectful to my brothers and sisters in Christ. So, nevertheless, I do think there's something interesting sociologically going on with my generation. And I want to sort of give a very different understanding of history here. If you would like to see reactions to this paper, there's one on Answers in Genesis from Nathaniel Jeanson. I understand Paul Garner is also composing his response. So you're welcome to go and look up things. In Joel's mind, a lot of what's going on in neo-creationism is, let's say, at least from the paper I gather, I don't know that this is his actual opinion, but from what he's written in the paper, it seems like it's all just posturing. We're trying to seem more credible and so forth. And so we decorate our pseudoscience with more sophisticated biology. That's nothing like my own experience, so I'm going to try to go through some historical ideas here to give a perspective on what I think is really going on that's different from, say, post-creationism, because I don't think we're beyond creationism at all. But first, as everybody is all getting really animated about this, I would like to remind you, this is not the first time that somebody has pointed out, a critic of creationism has pointed out what's going on. So here's a paper titled Ironic Heresy, How Young Earth Creationists Came to Embrace Rapid Microevolution by Means of Natural Selection. This is written by Ron Numbers. It's published in this book, The Darwinian Heresies, and it's published in 2004. I don't know if Joel is aware of this or if he cited it in his paper, but it's very similar themes and ideas, and there's a history here that goes back quite far and talks about early creationists who have advocated for sort of rapid diversification and speciation. So yeah, my big question is, post-creationism, really? Is that what I am? Have I gone beyond creationism? Am I no longer a creationist? I'm sure there are some people who would like to disown me, but that's another problem for another time. So let's start our little review of history here. I'm going to probably have to go through this pretty quick. I don't want to linger too long because I only have a certain amount of time and I have a lot of territory to cover. So let's get started. We'll go back and begin at the scientific revolution. We could go back even farther than that, the roots of the scientific revolution and the roots of Western culture and the roots of Christianity, but we got to start somewhere reasonable. So I'm going to say somewhere around 1543 is the year the scientific revolution really starts going, right? So we have two pretty important works published in that year. Copernicus on the motions of the celestial bodies, and then Vesalius on the fabric of the human body. And I cite both of these because Copernicus probably gets more credit for the scientific revolution and what follows the work of Copernicus in the next 120, 150 years as the motion of the cosmos is worked out. But as it turns out, that's a relatively easy problem compared to what is the function of the gallbladder or what is the function of the spleen. Those are far more challenging questions. And so Vesalius, though, provides us with, I think, the pivotal point in the history of the life sciences that corresponds to Copernicus' influence in the history of the physical sciences. And the key idea here, especially with Vesalius, is this notion that you have to see for yourself. That you don't simply take Aristotle's word for it or Galen's word for it, the ancient writers who gave us, for example, the doctrine of the humors or the ideas of spontaneous generation. You don't just believe them, but you go out and you do experiments and you do observations and you figure it out for yourself. Vesalius was a physician. He was interested in the anatomy, human anatomy, right? Obviously. And he was well known for shunning the standard method of anatomical dissection in his day, where the professor would sit to the side and read from Galen's works while the local butcher or barber would actually cut up the body that was available to them for dissection. And his students would stand around and watch. Vesalius did it himself. Vesalius got dirty. Vesalius did his own cutting and did his own discoveries and found many things that just didn't match up with what Galen had said in his works. This is then codified in the Royal Society's motto nullius in verba, which essentially means don't take anybody's word for it. So this is the key innovation, right? So Copernicus obviously is not taking the ancient testimony on the structure of the cosmos, or at least he's not totally throwing it out, but he's not accepting it as the only possible model. And so he entertains the idea of heliocentrism, the idea that the sun is at the center of the solar system and everything's moving around it. And I know, yes, elliptics, and it's not exactly the center. That's fine. Close enough for us biologists. Okay. And then in biology, Vesalius is saying, look, Galen's made a bunch of mistakes. We need to correct those, and we need to get out and find out these things for ourselves. And that leads then to a key question here, and that is, how do we proceed with this seeing things for yourself in light of what is written in the scripture? And this is why Galileo's trial is important. It is not because it is some sort of conflict between science and faith. That's not it at all. The question at hand was not whether theology and Christianity should be all-powerful versus these rebel scientists who are out for their own freedom or whatever. This freedom fighter myth that is sort of grown up around Galileo. The significance of Galileo is that he sort of established this is how we're going to proceed with understanding the relationship of science, scientific discoveries, and scripture. And his answer was accommodation. The idea that the scripture is complicated, words are complicated, and they can sometimes have more than one meaning. And so we should never take something from the Bible and insist that it can only be interpreted one way, and therefore science must be incorrect. Galileo had an extremely positive view of science, and many of the subsequent people, the subsequent scholars who followed Galileo's lead also had a very, very positive view of science. Science does not go wrong. Going out and seeing for yourself is better than just taking someone's word for it. And because science doesn't make mistakes, there you go. The Bible interpretation is the thing that ought to change if there's ever some kind of imagined conflict. So at the very beginning of science, and this is the really important part, we talk about the conflict of science, it's because at the very beginning of science, there was this wedge stuck into religion and science. The seeds of their eventual divorce and hostility were created. And so it's not that there was a long process of testing and evaluating and we came to the conclusion that religion is nonsense. It's actually, from the start, we decided religion can't have a role in what we're doing in science. And it was just a matter of time before it was just kicked out altogether. All right. This then leads to the world of natural theology. And you might be wondering, well, why would anyone accept this notion of accommodation? But here's why. Here's one of the reasons why. Because if you do your science apart from theology, then the results of science can be used as a legitimate support for the contentions of theology, right? So if you have your scientific research over here that does not make an assumption about theological truth, and it comes to the same conclusion as the theology, then it's independent verification, right? And if all truth is God's truth, then inevitably this will happen. Therefore, this became the course of the day, right? And this is, natural theology has much deeper roots than this, back to Aquinas and even farther back, and I don't want to pretend like this is all new. But accommodation fits into this whole world of, hey, let's argue for God, let's argue for his attributes, the revelation of Scripture, apart from using the Bible. Very explicitly. Examples of this, this here is a book called Principles and Duties of Natural Religion. It was published by a guy named John Wilkins. He was Bishop of Chester, written by John Wilkins. It was published posthumously in 1675. This is one of the earliest examples of this sort of what would come to be called natural theology under John Ray and William Paley. And in it, he basically sets out, I'm going to try to establish the morality and the principles, the facts of the Bible and Christianity by not using the Bible. I'm going to use reason, I'm going to use history, I'm going to use evidence, and I'm not going to use the Bible. And that's basically how this goes, right? What comes after this is this notion that we can create these design arguments that do not assume a designer, and therefore the conclusion of a designer becomes more compelling. And this becomes very, very popular. right? And so when Darwin comes along and sort of says there is no design, people go berserk a little bit, because he took away this good use of science as people saw it. And I can't pass by talking about design and these early authors without giving my favorite example of a design argument here from John Ray. Here, by the by, I cannot but look upon the strange instinct of this noisome and troublesome creature, the louse. Excuse me. Searching out foul and nasty clothes to harbor and breed in as an effective divine providence, designed to deter men and women from sluttishness and sordidness, and to provoke them to cleanliness and neatness. And then he gives some Bible verses of why that's important. That's kind of a classic example here, where you would sort of take reality as John Ray understood it, sort of try to explain, in a sense, why it does support the Bible. And it's kind of funny. I always find the idea of lice as a good design to cause us to avoid badness is kind of amusing to me. All right, anyway, moving on. We're going to fast forward a little bit because, as I say, we have a lot of ground to cover. Go to the early 1800s here. And as we fly by and fly over, we want to remind ourselves the towering accomplishments of Isaac Newton, providing essentially the mathematical foundation and explanation for heliocentrism. And with his work, then, the heliocentric debate essentially comes to an end. And yes, there were critics of Galileo, and yes, they persisted, but Newton sort of ended that debate effectively by explaining how gravity explained orbits, gravity explained Kepler's laws of planetary motion, and Newton put in place this notion of the clockwork universe, that everything's ticking along according to these very simple and regular mathematical descriptions, which he called natural law. Geology then, during that time period, 1700s and 1800s, early 1800s, we have the entire discipline as we know it emerging, right? So initially we have the acceptance of fossils as the remains of previously existing creatures, which was kind of a big deal because fossils are made of rock and creatures are not made of rock. So how could you have a creature made of rock that's natural? It didn't make sense to people. And then you had the problem of extinction. How could God allow something that he had created to die off permanently from the earth? It didn't make sense to people. But that was accepted. And it's usually attributed to the work of Georges Cuvier and his arguments. And then with Smith and Cuvier, then we have the recognition of stratigraphy, the regular, observable progression of fossil layers, and the observation then that the fossils in one layer are not exactly the same as the fossils in the next layer up. And so we have, it's basically the geologic column, right? So, and then we have in biology, and specifically I want to focus here on the question of species and speciation, right? So Francesco Redi does his experiments on the generation of insects, his famous experiment of leaving the rotten meat out and watching the maggots appear. At the end of his book, he gives his opinion that there's no spontaneous generation, that every creature traces its heritage back to the original pair created by God at the beginning, and they don't change, right? And so Redi gives us, in a sense, the basic notion of species fixity that will come to dominate biology for a long time. Here comes the train. I'll just apologize right now. It's going to be loud. And then after Francesca Redi, we have the work of John Ray and Linnaeus, who are then going around cataloging what they would recognize as species. Now, back to the questions of geology here. The changes in geology, the development of geology, the observations of what we now know as the fossil record, lead to various crises. There are people who sort of start to say, well, maybe the Earth is older than we thought. Maybe the Earth is substantially older. Maybe we're just the last creation on this planet after many previous creations. Who knows? And so the question then became, well, how do we reconcile this with what the Bible teaches about, for example, the flood? Or about creation. So we get Thomas Chalmers' solution. He would say that Genesis 1:1 simply represents an earlier creation than the rest of creation week. This comes to be known, it goes through quite a long development. It comes to be known what we would call the gap theory, right? That there was a initial creation that was destroyed, that produced the fossil record, and then we are then a recreation. William Buckland would be well known for arguing that the days of creation in Genesis 1 are analogies for periods of time. And these periods of time are indefinite, or maybe they are particular days that are not sequential, right? They don't go one after the other immediately. They don't follow immediately. So there's day 1, and then millions of years later, there's day 2, and who knows how long later, and there's day 3, and so forth. And his idea, the point that is being emphasized there, is that you have a rough, crude correspondence between the order in which God creates things in Genesis 1 and the order in which things appear in the fossil record. It is very crude, very imperfect. If you try to dial in on the details, you're going to find out it doesn't really work very well at all. But this became somewhat popular. Scriptural geologists then are known for their defense of what we might consider today flood geology. That the Earth is not old, it is thousands of years old, and that the flood is responsible for the fossil layers. Exactly which ones were a matter of debate for the scriptural geologists, but that's basically the idea. They would be flood geologists of the 19th century. And then you have even weirder Gauss's Omphalos argument that basically says that God creates with an appearance of age, and therefore there's no way that we could say that God did not create everything as we find it today 6,000 years ago. Which is an odd argument. So, and believe it or not, he's not the only one who advocated this. This was actually promoted by other people at the time. This is a book we've recently acquired here at Core Academy. Geology in its relation to revealed religion, published in 1853, taking this position, this Omphalos position. Omphalos, by the way, is a word that means navel, belly button. And it's referring to Adam being created with a belly button, which makes it appear that he had an umbilical cord at one time and that he has a scar from the umbilical cord. So that's the idea of appearance of age. This guy would argue, and others like him who picked up on the Omphalos argument would basically say, in Exodus 20, God created the earth, the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Well, we know what's in the sea, there's fish and creatures, and we know what's in the heavens, stars. But what's in the earth? What's in the earth? Well, fossils. So, fossils were created in the beginning in those 6 days by God. It's an odd argument. Doesn't really catch on, not surprising. Now, what's interesting about these guys, and I think this is where I want to really start to emphasize the modern application of the story, there's a lot of diversity of opinion that's run through all of these different authors. And so let's talk about gap theory and scriptural geology. There were some scriptural geologists that actually allowed for a period of time prior to the creation week during which specifically inorganic stuff could be created. The rock layers that don't have any fossils, they would say that could possibly be prior to creation week in Genesis 1. It's not gap theory in the sense of Satan falls and God sends judgment and wipes out all these creatures and forms the fossil record. But it's a kind of a gap theory in that Genesis 1:1 is a separate creation from what follows. So some examples, lots of examples of these guys. So the key here is that there's diversity. We have in our modern mind these sort of categories: gap theory, progressive creationist, theistic evolutionist, and so forth. These guys don't follow those rules. There's ideas that are being put together from what we would think of as different categories that end up stuck together in a single individual that makes things confusing. Another example of this, James Ivory Holmes, even stranger here, he would argue that the earliest rock layers formed before creation, and that the later rock and fossil layers formed in a catastrophic flood thousands of years ago, right? So another example of this weird syncretism of sticking together these ideas that we modern creationists keep very separate. They held them together. Okay. And I should also say here, there isn't one major idea that sort of captures the minds of all Christians in the world of geology at those days, or even those Christians who are somewhat dubious of geological claims. Everybody's got different ideas. People are putting, gap theory ideas together with young earth ideas and creating different sorts of things, and so forth. So you get this odd mixture because there's no one dominant claim. And then into this, drop like a bomb, comes Origin of Species. And of course, it's revolution in biology, there's no doubt about it. It's a paradigm shift, whatever you want to call it. The argument for evolution that Darwin puts forward is far more compelling than previous arguments that had been made by people like Chambers or the French guy's name is, don't tell me, Lamarck, that's it. I knew I had to remember it. I'm getting old. Anyway, Darwin comes along, drops a bomb in this whole process, and suddenly everything changes, right? Because Darwin is so immensely popular and so dominant in the world of natural history, interpreting the fossil record, the focus kind of shifts to him. So after Origin, scriptural geology, and I didn't really mention this very much, but there were ideas of species variability, sort of much more limited ideas of species variability. Chambers and Lamarck would argue for big evolution, macroevolution, changes that produced lots of different living forms. There were others who were arguing that maybe species aren't fixed at all and that there's much more variability in species. All of those get derailed, right? So you look at the history of scriptural geology and the writings on scriptural geology and you find out 1860 is the big year. After 1860, scriptural geology works seem to just disappear and dry up. Well, yeah, because everyone's focused now on Origin of Species and its interpretation of the fossil record. And that changes the way people think about these things. And so these ideas get derailed. By 1875, most of the scholarly world has come to accept common ancestry in the development of species. They have decided that Darwin's idea, Darwin's interpretation of the fossil record, Darwin's interpretation of classification as a giant evolutionary tree, these things are the right answer. This is how we're going to explain the diversity of species today and the history of life on this planet. But at the same time, there was a great deal of debate over what could cause evolution. There was a lot of skepticism about natural selection. There were plenty of people who accepted natural selection, which is Darwin's model for how this happens. And there were others who just said, no, that doesn't work, for various reasons. And so historians have called this period the eclipse of Darwin, where you have the basic idea of evolution is now accepted more or less, but people are still arguing over how it happens. And here's where it's really starting to get interesting. The opposition to evolution, the people who are upset by what Darwin has done, by 1875, that falls to individual churches. And in America, in the United States, where you have a very populist approach to religion, where individual pastors draw a following based on their preaching, that's where creationism goes. It is not that there are no creationists after 1860, before 1960, when the Genesis flood was published. It's instead that you don't find them in the sort of scholarly world anymore. Where you find them is in the sort of Sunday school magazines and things like that, where people generally don't look. So creationism doesn't die, it just changes rather dramatically. But also, at this point, we have the rise of what I like to refer to as anti-evolution, where, and I noticed this researching the history of creationism, looking at books, reading books from the 20s, from the teens, from the 19th century that are arguing against Darwin or against evolution. And the entire book is an argument against evolution. You finish reading it and you literally have no idea what the author actually believes about the history of God's creation. Some of them I end up and I don't even know, is the author a Christian? Is the author arguing from a Christian perspective? Or are they just mad about evolution? And this thread of history then culminates in the Scopes trial, our next really big watershed moment. And for those of you who are not Americans, so those of you who might be somewhat unfamiliar with the history here in my town where I live, in 1925, the state of Tennessee, at the encouragement of people like William Jennings Bryan, who was conducting a national crusade against human evolution in particular, because he felt that it degraded the special created status of humanity. The state of Tennessee passed an ordinance forbidding the teaching of human evolution in its schools, in its public schools. Particularly, and it didn't single out human evolution, it just said any story that denies the creation of human beings is described in the Bible, right? And so that meant the only other alternative at the time was human evolution. But I suppose it could mean anything else you wanted to say. Native American mythology, for example. And William Jennings Bryan, Clarence Darrow come to town after the ACLU put out an advertisement for people to basically break the law in order that they could have a test case. Some of the people here in town thought that would be something they would want to do here, and so they convinced a high school coach named John Scopes to volunteer to be arrested. He was a substitute biology teacher. There's not really any specific evidence that he actually broke the law. And there are persistent stories that when the students who testified against him, the day that they were going to testify, he sat in the back of a car and explained to them evolution, read to them out of their textbook, the parts about evolution, so that they wouldn't perjure themselves. So it was a bit of a sham, but it drew enormous public attention. It was one of the first trials to be broadcast. You can see right over here, that weird looking thing is a microphone from WGN in Chicago. So the trial was broadcast on the radio. It was a big deal. And the consequences, the fallout of the trial then, we have textbook publishers who become jittery. So this book right here. This is Hunter's Civic Biology, which is the textbook in question at the trial. There are literally maybe a page or two. There's not much on evolution in this book. Probably should have bookmarked it before I started, but there it is. Yeah, so this is my problem. I'm flipping through this book. I can't even find the page where evolution is described. There's basically 2 or 3 pages in this whole thing where evolution is described. But after the Scopes trial, publishers began to think, we don't want to stir up strife. We don't want to cause problems with our book sales, so we're just going to take out explicit references to evolution. Evolutionary concepts, some evolutionary concepts, inheritance and so forth, would continue to be included, but it just wouldn't be called evolution. It wouldn't be emphasized, the interpretation of the fossil record and so forth. So that then creates this period of time after 1925 where you have several decades of people being raised and taught in American public schools, but not learning much of anything about evolution. We also have, as you might imagine, the public mockery of creationism and Christianity. I would say that sort of the academics thought they won. Certainly the big city reporters who came here and watched the trial came away thinking that Tennessee is a bunch of buffoons, and the forces of religion had been defeated, or obscurantist religion had been defeated, and therefore, good on us, we won, and yay. But in reality, those people who agreed with Brian, or were sympathetic to Brian, or opposed evolution, they did not have that same view of what happened at the trial. They didn't go anywhere. And so there's this split which happens, which is not so good. And at the same time, the trial is sort of the culmination of the anti-evolutionist movement. The creationists of the time, people like George McCready Price, Frank Marsh and so forth, well, not so much Frank Marsh, but George McCready Price and his colleagues, they would look at the trial and they would say, this is a mess. They don't talk anything about science. It's all about the Bible. So we need to work more on the science. So 20th century creationism, as I mentioned, George McCready Price begins advocating flood geology again in 1902 with his book Illogical Geology. It's a very short thing, small. Basic ideas here: the flood accounts for the majority of the fossil record. The history of life on this planet is recent. Evolution is definitely wrong. And that the issue is important doctrinally. It has important social consequences. So he would agree with William Jennings Bryan's assessment of the bad results of evolution, degrading humanity, causing wars, and so forth. he would just say that you got to be more scholarly. You got to be better than just quoting the Bible at people. Now, early on, his efforts to attract a following and start a movement produced very meager results. So, for example, that should say 1933. Pardon me one moment. I'm going to fix this slide for posterity. Yeah, okay. So we have Price and Price's followers, Harold Clark. He earns a master's degree in biology in 1933 from Berkeley. And then Frank Marsh earned a PhD in botany in 1940 from the University of Nebraska. And there are a couple of other people who are not very formally trained who sort of become attached peripherally to what Price is doing. Price is kind of a tough buzzard, hard to get along with a little bit, so that has something to do with probably why he had a hard time sparking a movement. In the 40s, they tried to put together a deluge geology society, and it pretty much folded within 5 years. It was gone. So the efforts to sort of get creationism going there in the early 20th century are not very successful. Meanwhile, going back to the debates over the mechanism of evolution, the idea of the eclipse of Darwin, right? 1875, everybody's basically, the scholarly world is convinced that evolution is the explanation for the fossil record and for various large-scale features of living creatures. And then after that, they argued about how evolution happens. So these debates continued. Then in the 30s, we have Fisher, Haldane, and Wright, who contribute to what we now think of as the neo-Darwinian synthesis. They did this by providing a mathematical description of how natural selection worked with Mendelian, contemporary Mendelian-style genetics. So in a sense, they are the Newton to Darwin's Copernicus, right? So Darwin gives the conceptual framework of how evolution could work. Fisher, Haldane, and Wright work out all the math in the same way that Copernicus described the heliocentric model, and Newton tied it all together with gravity and orbits and orbital motion. Okay, so this model then begins to spread through other disciplines. It takes a while. There was no internet in those days, right? So you couldn't just post it on archive.org and have it spread that way. But it eventually spreads. People become convinced. Of course, there's a lot of distraction in the 40s because of World War II. But people become generally convinced that this idea of the neo-Darwinian synthesis is the dominant explanation for how evolution could occur. So by the 50s, the eclipse has been settled, and neo-Darwinian synthesis is accepted, sort of mainstream biology, as the main explanation for evolution. Then in 1959, we have the centennial that celebrates the 100th anniversary of the publication of Origin of Species. It's a big conference and celebration in Chicago where scientists basically bring out the neo-Darwinian synthesis essentially to the public and to other scientists and show it off and say, this is it. We've resolved everything now. It's been 100 years, been a long debate, but now everything is settled. We know that evolution is true and that it happens this way. And there are voices at this conference and around surrounding these events that say, you know, we have all this stuff worked out, but it's not in the biology textbooks. Our kids are not being taught the importance and the value of evolution to biology and geology. Because remember, the Scopes trial scuttled evolution in textbooks. People began to get nervous about evolution in their textbooks, and so they took it out. So basically from 1925 to 1960, people were not taught about evolution in high school. So there became this movement to change the textbooks, and the textbooks of the 60s then became, in some sense, comparatively speaking, they became soaked in evolutionary claims. So that parents who grew up in the 50s and didn't hear much about anything about evolution in biology class or in their science classes, had kids coming home to them in the 60s who were saying, "Mommy, look at this thing that I got from, it says millions of years old, and there is no design, and it's all evolved, and nothing makes sense in the light in biology except in the light of evolution. How do we, what am I supposed to do about this?" So there is this massive, massive culture shock that happens when publishers decide we need a monumental change in the textbooks that we're producing. This, of course, would eventually lead in the 60s to the overturning of the anti-evolution law in several states, including Tennessee. It had been on the books since then. No one had ever been tried under it. No one had ever tried to enforce it, but it was there. And then we have the Genesis flood. This is huge, and everybody understands this book to be huge. Most of us watching this probably have a copy or have read a copy. This was in my house growing up. So the Genesis flood provides a general model of Earth history based on flood geology, particularly based on Price's flood geology. There was some modification to it, of course. It was updating, obviously, but the general concepts are from George McCready Price. And the Genesis flood gave a wide swath of evangelical Christianity a reason to care about what was happening. The global flood, recent creation, are true, genuine teachings of Scripture, and they're doctrinally important, and we can't just ignore them. And the Genesis flood, providentially published in 1960, becomes a rallying point against the radical change in high school textbooks. So the reason you have all these fights over what's taught in science classrooms that run all the way through the 1980s, the Louisiana case in the 1980s, it's all coming out of this massive shift that happened initially because the Scopes trial caused textbook publishers to pull evolution stuff out of their textbooks. Then they decided to throw it back in a big, big way, which freaked out parents. This book then gave them that rallying point. This gave them an alternative story to explain, or at least to try to explain, the history of creation and the earth from a perspective that was not evolutionary. And this is another key point here. This book, The Genesis Flood, settled debates for many people over day age or gap theory or other varieties of creationism in favor of young age creationism and flood geology. So the weird diversity of opinions that happened in the 19th century are not present anymore. Even in the anti-evolution world, you could have people who were gap theory creationists, who were progressive creationists and so forth, of various stripes and versions. But all of that sort of gets put to the side. Gap theory creationism in particular goes extinct, essentially. I think there are a couple of people still around, not very prominent voices, still advocating that. So that's our next major shifting point, being both the Darwin Centennial in '59 and the publication of the Genesis flood the following year. And what then happens over the last 60 years? Here's the idea that I want to emphasize. Creationist writings proliferate, filling in details of the Whitcomb-Morris model and proposing new ideas to answer questions that they had not addressed. Right? So that people born after the Genesis flood was published did not need to sort through a smorgasbord of ideas or invent their own explanations, right? I grew up in this post-Genesis flood world, a post-flood world, if you will, where gap theory was not acceptable, day age theory was not acceptable. The correct answer is flood geology and young earth creationism. And so that left me free to sort of pursue simpler and more nuanced questions about biology and fossils and so forth. And the Genesis flood obviously didn't do away with progressive creationists. There are still progressive creationists. I'd say, based on the surveys, half of evangelicals in the United States are, in some sense, an old earth creationist. But for a huge part of evangelicalism, young age creationism becomes obviously correct. It becomes the model that we all subscribe to. And so the details then can be filled in. So when I talk about the books written, right? This is the Core Academy Library, which is basically in that room right over there, next door to where I am right now. This is the view right outside my office. More than 5,000 books, not all of them on creationism, but many of them on topics of creationism. This is not something that would be available to someone who grew up in the 20s or the 30s, where they sort of had to answer much bigger, more profound questions about the age of the earth. Is the earth really old or is it not? And so forth. So I inherit the world, a world that is essentially sort of sorted through these questions and decided this is the right path to go, which leaves me free to look at more narrow questions. So am I a post-creationist? Have I moved beyond creationism? No. I'm a native. I didn't have to immigrate to creationism. I grew up with it. And as such, just like every other immigrant's kids, I don't have to rebuild my life. I don't have to build a new life. I can continue on and build on the foundation that's already there, right? So I think it's really amazing and cool because basically, I think Kurt Wise is 10 years older than I am, and he's born basically right after the Genesis flood. So Kurt Wise and I are sort of the vanguards of this really early world of native creationists. Kurt's testimony is a little different. He had to come to creationism. I was basically raised as a creationist. Many people in the same boat. We are now freed from worrying about all these other larger questions, and we can pursue narrow questions like created kinds, which is something I'm interested in, or hominin fossils, another thing I'm interested in. And if you think this sounds familiar, it should sound familiar because it is essentially Thomas Kuhn's idea, right? With the paradigm shift. So I think the Genesis flood, producing this generation of native creationists, born and raised as creationists, this generates a generation that's working on what Kuhn would call normal science. The paradigm has been resolved for many people, and now the details have to be worked out. And that's what we're working on. So parting thoughts here. I would say, on the one hand, young age creationism today really is different from what it was even 30 years ago. Even when I was, just going off to college. Creationism has changed a lot. And ideas about geology and biology have become the objects of disagreement. Where should we put the flood post-flood boundary? How big are created kinds? How should we identify them? And so forth. The core commitments, however, to the historicity of Genesis 1 through 11 remain, and they unite us all, even though we all have very different ideas about the fine details. We're all still creationists. We're not post-creationists. We have not moved beyond creationism. We've simply taken ideas that were rough and crude and speculations from that early generation of immigrant creationists, the one who had to be convinced of creationism. We've taken those kernels of ideas and we've applied them and run with them and tried to produce something that makes sense, to figure out how does this all work as a description of our world and of creation. And it's not because we've moved on. It's not because we've become convinced that evolution must be true or some nonsense like that. We're not out to earn credibility. I gave that up before I even got to grad school. I knew there was no credibility for creationism. We're just natives, and we do what natives do, right? We take the foundation that we've been given. We go farther than that early immigrant generation could have ever dreamed. And it seems extreme from certain perspectives, but there is a logic to all of it, even if we might find it faulty in some cases. And that faulty part is what we all are arguing about now in young age creationism. So I just want to thank Joel for a fascinating paper. Even though I rather passionately disagreed with a lot of it, it really started me thinking and gave me a really fun time thinking about, I grew up with this stuff. No wonder, and so many people today have grown up with this material, no wonder we look different from the generation that produced the material. We're taking those ideas and we're applying them and running with them and going with them. So thanks, Joel. Fun paper. Hope you liked my response. Not really interested in point-by-point rebuttal, but yeah, I think it's pretty cool. So, and the rest of you, thanks for watching. I really have enjoyed Origins this year. It's been a fascinating experience, and I look forward to hopefully being together again in person next year in New York. I don't know that I'm allowed to say that, but I just did back in New York. So thanks for watching. See you later.